My name is Daniel Whitaker, and I've been hunting in the deep forests of Minnesota since I was a kid. I grew up around the woods, taught by my father and my uncle how to track, how to read the land, and most importantly, how to respect it. Hunting has never been about the kill for me. It's about the solitude, the challenge, and the connection to the wild. But one night last fall, deep in the backwoods, I experienced something that shattered my entire understanding of the world. I haven't spoken about it much, mostly because I don't expect anybody to believe me, but I know what I saw, and I wasn't alone. I had set up camp near the base of a densely wooded ridge, miles from the nearest road. It was mid-November, and the cold had settled into the land, making the air crisp and my breath barely visible in the dim lantern light. My plan was to spend the weekend tracking elk, hoping to fill my tag before the season ended. That first day had been uneventful. I saw some prints, a few rubs on the trees, but nothing worth pursuing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I returned to my small clearing, got a fire going, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. The forest was dense, the towering pines stretching endlessly in every direction. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and a low wind whispered through the branches. The night was still, except for the occasional distant call of an owl. Beyond my campfire's glow, the woods were an abyss of shadows, thick and impenetrable. It was the kind of darkness that swallowed everything, making it impossible to tell where the trees ended and the sky began. The sky was clear, the kind of vast unbroken darkness that only exists far from city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, and I could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the distance. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. Around 10 PM I was stoking the fire, and I noticed something odd, a light, well, several lights moving in the sky. At first I thought that they were planes, but their movements, they didn't match. They weren't following any straight paths or any predictable flight patterns. Instead, they zigzagged, stopped abruptly, then shot off at impossible directions. I watched dumbfounded as they pulsed with an eerie white glow, shifting and reappearing in different positions across the sky. I tried to rationalize it, military aircraft, some kind of drone test, but deep down I knew nothing earthly moved like that. A deep unease settled in my gut, the kind you feel when you realize that your entire paradigm was about to shift. The woods around me, once familiar and comforting, suddenly felt vast and unknowable. I grabbed my rifle, not because I thought I'd need it, but because it was the only thing grounding me to reality. Then the lights changed. The glowing orbs, which had been darting around unpredictably, suddenly coalesced into a single form. A strange, almost liquid-looking shape that hovered with unnatural stillness. It had an eerie luminescence, like cold fire shifting from white to a deep electric blue. It was completely silent, impossibly so. No hum of an engine, no rush of displaced air, just a presence, as if the sky itself had cracked open and let something foreign slip through. I felt small beneath it, insignificant, like an ant staring up at God. My breath came in short gasps as my skin prickled with the static. The air around me was thick with an energy that I couldn't place. I could feel it in my teeth, a low vibrating hum, though I heard nothing. And then, just as eerily as it had formed, the shape split apart again, breaking into several orbs that descended towards the ridge about a mile from my camp. My heart pounded as I watched them deep below the tree line, their glow casting long, unnatural shadows against the pines. And then, just as quickly as they had come, they disappeared. The silence that followed was worse than the lights themselves. The usual nocturnal sounds, crickets, distant owl calls, even the rustling of small animals had all stopped. The woods were holding their breath, afraid. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire. I had to see what was on the other side of that ridge. I moved cautiously, my boots crunching against the frozen leaves as I climbed, rifle slung over my shoulder and my pulse hammering in my ears. The higher I got, the more unnatural everything felt, like I had crossed into a place where I wasn't supposed to be. A few moments later, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I staggered momentarily before taking a second to steady myself against a tree. I saw them. At first they were just pale shapes, moving between the trees. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. They were humanoid, tall but impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and smooth, almost featureless skin. They didn't walk like people. Their movements were deliberate but fluid, like they were gliding as much as stepping. The forest around them seemed untouched, primal, with thick undergrowth and towering trees that stretched into the darkness. Like I said, the undergrowth was dense, and yet they moved effortlessly through it. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting long, ghostly shadows that twisted their every motion. It felt like stepping out into another world, one that had never belonged to us. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, spaced out as if surveying the area. They weren't wandering aimlessly, they had a purpose. I crouched behind a fallen log, barely daring to breathe. They weren't looking for me, they didn't seem concerned with anything but their task, whatever it was. They moved carefully, almost methodically, as though they were collecting data, studying the ground, the trees, like scientists examining a new ecosystem. I should have run, I should have turned back, packed up and got the hell out of there, but I couldn't. I was transfixed, watching them, trying to understand. I'd spent my whole life studying animal behaviour, understanding how creatures interacted with their environment, and these things, they weren't lost, they weren't confused, they were working. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. Every single one of them turned in unison, facing the same direction. My stomach clenched as I realised they were staring directly at me. I don't know how they saw me in the darkness. I hadn't moved, I hadn't made a sound, but they knew. For what felt like an eternity, we just stayed like that, me frozen behind the log, and them standing eerily still in the moonlight. Then one of them tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, almost like it was acknowledging me. And that was it, that was enough. I turned and I ran. I don't remember descending the ridge, my legs carried me on pure instinct. I barely noticed the branches whipping against my face. I burst into my camp, shoved everything I could into my backpack and left the rest. I didn't care, I just needed to get away. I hiked through the night, not stopping until I reached my truck at the trailhead. The moment I was inside, I locked the doors and sped down the old dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see those pale figures standing there at the tree line. But I didn't. I haven't been back to that spot since. Those lights in the sky weren't natural, and those things in the woods, they weren't human. The scariest part, though, was that they didn't seem malevolent, they didn't chase me, they didn't try to harm me. They just watched, studied, like I was the stranger in their world, like I was the one being observed. Call me Captain Z. I want to tell my story, but please respect my anonymity. I'm keeping it for obvious reasons. I've been a pilot for 23 years. I mostly fly light commercial aircraft, the kind used for small charter flights and cargo runs. Flying was always my passion since childhood, and even after 1,000 hours in the sky, I never lost the thrill of taking off and seeing the world from above. But one flight, late one evening in 2019, changed the way I look at the sky forever. I was piloting a twin-engine Saab 340A turboprop, a small but very reliable aircraft. That night I was transporting a small cargo shipment from Reno, Nevada to a small private airstrip in Montana. It was a routine night flight, one that I'd done dozens of times before. The air was calm, the sky was clear, and the only company I had up there was the occasional commercial jet passing miles above me. The cockpit was quiet, except for the steady hum of the engines and the faint chatter of air traffic control. The world below was a patchwork of darkness scattered with the occasional glow of small towns and highways. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude that I enjoy. I had just crossed into Idaho's airspace at around 12,000 feet when my instruments flickered. It wasn't a full failure, just a brief, strange glitch. The altimeter wavered, and the radio crackled with static, and my GPS reset itself for no apparent reason. The whole event lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then everything was fine. I double-checked my systems, but there were no warning signs or failures, just an odd blip. This was unusual for the Saab. Like I said, it was a very reliable aircraft. I shrugged it off and kept flying. About 20 minutes later, I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision. Off to my northeast, just above the horizon, there was a light. At first I assumed it was another aircraft, but it was unlike any navigation light I'd ever seen. It wasn't flashing, it was just a steady white glow. Like I said, initially I thought the light was actually very far off and moving relatively slowly. But as I monitored it, I realised it was actually much closer than I had realised, and that it was actually keeping pace with me. The more I watched it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just keeping up with me, it was mirroring my every movement. I could feel my heart start to beat a little bit faster. In an attempt to calm my nerves and reassure myself that there was some kind of logical explanation to what I was seeing, I tried to contact air traffic control. ATC, this is Sierra 907, I've got an aircraft on my 9 o'clock, same altitude, same heading, can you confirm? Over. No response. Static. I repeated my request. Nothing. My radio wasn't dead, it was still transmitting, so I changed the radio receiver frequency to that of my transmitter frequency to see if I could pick something up. What I heard instantly sent me into fear, a sudden burst of high amplitude static, in the same frequency band as my transmitter. Now before I continue, I want to tell you I'm a former Air Force pilot, and to be precise, an electronic warfare operational support specialist. So I know about jamming techniques, and I have some authority on the subject. I have flown missions in highly contested EMS environments, such as NATO Red Flag, and I know what it is to be jammed, and I'm telling you, this thing was jamming me. With this realization I glanced back at the light and my stomach tightened. It had moved closer, much closer, and it wasn't an aircraft, it was a sphere of white light, maybe the size of a car, hovering just outside my left wingtip. It had no visible aerofoil, no structure, no wings, no rotor blades, just a glowing orb, completely silent. The unnatural stillness of it sent chills down my spine. My heart pounded. I knew I should stay calm, but every instinct screamed at me to move, to get away from whatever this was. I nudged the yoke to the right, banking away slightly. The light matched me, perfectly. There was no time lag. It moved exactly when I moved and exactly the distance that I moved. I pushed forward on the throttle, gaining speed, and the light kept up effortlessly. Then, suddenly, my entire cockpit lit up like daylight. The orb pulsed, sending out a flash so bright that I had to squeeze my eyes shut. My headset screeched with an unbearable high-pitched whine. My instruments went berserk, altimeter spinning wildly, artificial horizon rolling like it was in a nosedive, even though I knew it was flying straight. The engines sputtered for a split second, making my stomach lurch, but then they roared back to life. Outside the cockpit, the sky itself seemed to warp. The stars around the orb bent and distorted like ripples in water. It was as if space itself was shifting. I gritted my teeth, gripping the yoke tighter, fighting the nauseating sensation of being pulled in multiple directions at once. And then, just as fast as it happened, it stopped. The cockpit dimmed back to normal, my instruments stabilized, and my radio crackled back to life. I gasped for breath, my hands trembling on the controls. I looked left, and the light was gone. For the next 40 minutes, I flew in stunned silence, gripping the yoke so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to believe it was some kind of hallucination, a trick of the light, something, anything that made logical sense. But deep down I knew better. The way it moved, the way it disrupted my instruments, the way the very air around it seemed to ripple. It wasn't something of this world. As I approached my destination, the control tower finally responded to my check-in. Their voices sounded normal, unaware that I had been flying in radio silence for nearly an hour. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but what could I say? A ball of light chased me through the sky and shut down my plane for a few seconds. I knew it'd sound insane. Thankfully, I landed safely in Montana, and after shutting down the aircraft, I just sat in the cockpit, staring at the empty sky. After a few minutes, I made my way to the airstrip's admin office to submit my paperwork. I still felt nauseated, and a heavy tiredness had taken over me. "Evening, got my F-102s here," I said to the administrator on shift. "You look rough, what took you so long? You're late," he replied. I checked my watch, and he was right. I didn't reply, I just shrugged my shoulders, rubbed my head, and hobbled towards the restroom. Shortly after, I collapsed into one of the pilot handover beds. After waking up, I decided not to report the incident. Who would believe me? It wasn't a weather phenomenon, it wasn't another plane, it was something else, something that I wasn't meant to understand. As a side note to the inevitable comments, I want to mention that out of an obligation to air safety regulations, I did report the comms and guidance systems glitches. Oddly, the maintenance crew did get back to me on this, which they normally never do, but I suspect this was more a means to alleviate their own puzzlement. They were trying to ascertain how two very specific things could be. Firstly, the communications and navigations equipment subcomponents contained items made from cadmium. Sometimes these equipment pieces also contain cadmium dust, and particles which are carcinogenic and therefore harmful to humans. According to the maintenance guys, only the equipment pieces containing elements or traces of cadmium had been the ones that had required either replacement or recalibration due to what looked like damage caused by rapid heat expansion and contraction. The second item makes even less sense. After landing, the ground crew had deemed it necessary to refuel my aircraft after all their post-flight checks had been completed, and they were startled to discover that I had over 90 minutes worth of extra fuel in my tanks. In many cases this could be explained by favourable wind speed and direction, but I was flying into headwinds that night. What this all means for my story, I have no idea. Maybe someone in this forum will know, so I included it. Since that night I've developed an obsession with reading up about UFO phenomena and speaking to fellow experiencers. This is why I'm on here, telling you this story now. It's cathartic to let it out and read your comments to my post, to just know that I'm not alone in this and that I'm not insane. Now when I fly at night, I still find myself glancing to my left, half expecting to see that silent, impossible light keeping pace with me once more. And every now and then, just for a second, I swear I do. My name is James, and this happened to me about 3 years ago. I've never been able to fully explain it, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. It was late October, and I was driving alone through a remote stretch of the Appalachian Mountains, heading home from a weekend visit to an old friend in West Virginia. I had spent the weekend catching up with my buddy Mason, who I hadn't seen in years. We used to be inseparable back in the college days, but life had pulled us in different directions. He had a small cabin near Elkins, and we spent the days hiking the trails and fishing nearby rivers, just like we used to. At night we sat by the fire trading old stories and drinking beer, reminiscing about the past. It had been one of the best weekends I'd had in a long time, and I was reluctant to leave. But work was waiting for me back home in Tennessee, so I packed up and hit the road late Sunday evening, hoping to make it back before dawn. The road was long and winding, with dense forest on either side. No street lights, barely any other cars, just me, my truck, and the cold night air. The Appalachians have always felt different at night. Unlike the open plains or the desert highways, the trees just seem to lean in on you, swallowing up the road. Shadows stretch unnaturally between them, and the only sounds are the occasional rustling of leaves or distant calls of unseen animals. I've always loved night drives, but this one felt different. It was too quiet, too empty. It was like the whole world had gone to sleep, except for me. The mountains themselves had a presence, something ancient and watchful. The roads twisted through the steep inclines and deep hollows, with cliffs dropping off just beyond the guardrails. Pockets of thick fog clung to the valleys, and every so often a pair of deer eyes would flash in my headlights before disappearing into the dark. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth, and the crisp essence of fall setting in. Despite the heater running, I felt a deep chill in my bones, an unease that I couldn't shake. I was about an hour into my drive when I noticed something in the sky. At first I thought it was just a bright star, maybe even a planet, but after a few minutes I realised it was moving. Slowly at first, then more erratically. It darted from one position to another, too fast to be an aircraft that I knew of. I turned down the music and focused in on it, feeling my stomach tighten. The radio hissed sharply for a second, making me almost jump out of my seat. I continued to focus on the light, hypnotised by both its beauty and its mystery. But the more I watched it, the more that feeling of unease rose in my gut. I tried convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I already knew better. As I rounded a bend in the road, the light seemed to follow me, staying just above the treetops. It must have been closer than I thought. My pulse quickened. I told myself it had to be a drone, maybe some sort of military aircraft, but deep down I knew something about it wasn't right. The way it moved, how silently it hovered, it felt unnatural. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly. The light grew brighter, pulsing slightly, and then, just as I reached a straight stretch of road, it shot forward at an impossible speed and stopped directly above me. My entire truck lit up like it was midday. Every shadow disappeared, as if the moon itself had been replaced by this thing in the sky. My headlights, dashboard, even my phone screen glitched for a moment and then flickered off. Blinded, I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. The light stayed still for a moment, hovering above me, and then it began to move in a slow, deliberate circle. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something that I couldn't explain. My ears rang with a high-pitched hum, not coming from my truck, but from the air itself. The trees around me trembled slightly, their leaves rustling despite the absence of wind. I felt my body grow tense, like something was pressing against me, an invisible weight, as if I were being pulled in all directions. The smell of burning electronics filled the air. My hands began to tingle, the same way they do when you get too close to a static charge. Then, without warning, my engine sputtered and died. The dashboard went black, and so did my headlights. My truck was dead, but I hadn't touched a thing. Panic set in, my breathing grew shallow as I fumbled for my phone. The screen flickered wildly before showing some kind of static instead of my lock screen. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was blood pounding in my ears. The light above me pulsed again, and I felt a deep instinctual fear, like I was facing something that I was never meant to see. At this point, my body tensed and cramped. I'm not religious, but I began to pray. I prepared myself for whatever was to come next. I honestly believed I was about to die. At that moment, a feeling of nausea took over. My vision narrowed and I came close to blanking out. And then, just before I was about to lose consciousness, as suddenly as it had come, it vanished. Not like it flew away. 1 second it was there, and then the next it was just gone. The darkness of the mountains swallowed everything, leaving me sitting in the middle of an empty road, my hands shaking. My truck's engine roared back to life on its own, my headlights blinking on as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I slammed my foot on the gas and drove faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I reached the next town. A few minutes later, I finally pulled over into a gas station. I sat in the truck trying to calm my breathing. I checked my phone. It was 2:47 a.m. The last time I checked the clock, it had been 1:03. I don't remember where that missing hour and 40 minutes went, and I don't want to remember. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. I never told anybody the full story, just bits and pieces. I'm worried they'd think I was crazy. Even though I always thought people on TV talking about UFOs were crackpots, now I am a believer. I am one of those crackpots. But now, every time I drive through the mountains at night, I keep an eye on the sky, half expecting to see that light again. And every time, I pray that I don't.